Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. Or maybe a better title will be It Seems It Starts to Happen Again. I'm Evelyn Marcus, and I'm Evelyn Marcus.
And I'm Phyllis Zimpler-Miller.
This is day 24 of the war in Israel. 4 hostages have been released. The Israel Defense Forces have started their ground invasion of Gaza. People around the globe protest mostly for a ceasefire and against Israel, and Jew hatred has intensified enormously. We have the privilege to have Michael Berenbaum back in our show for a new update about the war. Michael Berenbaum, PhD and rabbi, is the director of the Sigi Ziering Institute for exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust, and a professor of Jewish studies at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. He's the author and editor of 18 books, and he was the executive editor of the new Encyclopedia Judaica. Michael speaks daily with experts on the war in Israel, and this morning he spoke himself at Fox News. Welcome, Michael. Welcome back, and thank you for coming on and giving us an update. We all follow the news. What do you see as the most important developments of the last 7 days?
Well, I think the most important development, obviously, is on the ground. And the development on the ground, essentially, as Israel has entered Gaza, it has not entered Gaza so much in massive numbers with a full-fledged invasion. It's gone in a series of different types of strikes designed, I think, to probe the enemy and also designed to see and capture intelligence. The other elements that have been present now has been an increasingly anti-Israel sentiment being expressed by certain faculty on major campuses, most particularly Ivy League campuses. We've had an event at Cornell. We had an event at Columbia University, where in excess of 100 faculty have signed for an open debate on Hamas and Israel. We also had at Cornell death threats to Jewish students, and that becomes significant. We also, I believe, though I have no confirmation at this point, has that Israel had freed one female soldier hostage this morning. I just heard it en passant in the news, so it may or may not be accurate, but if so, that's optimistic because it says that they are getting somewhere in that. You also had a series of appearances by Israel's government, and the government at this point is intriguing because it's the security government is 3 people. It's the defense minister, the prime minister, and a person who joined Benny Gantz, who is a former chief of the IDF and also defense minister, who has joined the government for this purposes. There are 2 other observers. But the intriguing thing is that Benjamin Netanyahu did not appear alone. He appeared with the full security cabinet, which tells us 2 things. It tells us a weakening of his own credibility vis-a-vis his population and the Israelis, and that is that after what happened on October 7th, the government is under, and one would have to say rightful, disquiet from its own citizens, and consequently he appeared with the security cabinet to say we've reached another stage of the war, and that's important. American support is holding steady, though we're experiencing 2 different things. One is a problem from the progressive left, which has diminished a certain measure of support for Joe Biden, who has held firm and steady. We've also seen an attempt to isolate in the House of Representatives the bill that the president set up, which includes aid to Israel, aid to Ukraine, aid to Taiwan and border security funds. So that becomes important to see how the politics of it plays out. The other thing I think we have to notice at this point is that the United States is interested in opening a corridor for aid to come to Gaza because of the humanitarian issue. We have to say two things, and this our audience should be clear about. Number one, Hamas is holding up the evacuation of American citizens from Gaza, figuring that it needs the American citizens in a very real way as a negotiating point with the American government. And Hamas is refusing to release its supply of fuel and asking for new fuel supplies to come into Gaza. And Israel is not permitting those fuel supplies. Gaza says the hospitals are running out of fuel. It's been saying that for 23 days. And Israel is saying Hamas will take control of this fuel, use it to power their tunnels, to power their military operation. So we have an enormous dispute, though what is not of dispute is that the conditions in Gaza are difficult, that Hamas presumed that they would be difficult, and that was part of the reason why that was an anticipated result of the Hamas attack. And consequently, if they had the primacy of the safety and security of the Palestinian population in Gaza as their principal concern, they would not have initiated the attack on October 7th. And consequently, one could predict exactly how Israel would respond to that, and it did. So
Michael, I think it's so important. I think you need to say this again. I think that really, and I don't say left, right, I'm just talking about uninformed people who really don't understand that when Hamas, which is the government of Gaza, duly elected in 2006, 2007, chose to do what they did, they knew how much the Palestinian people in Gaza would suffer.
Phyllis, I want to say not only did they know how much the Palestinian people in Gaza would suffer, but they banked on that as part of their strategy. Their strategy is that they play the victim card, which they believe would give them some protection against a full-throated Israeli response. And one presumes they had to know that Israel would respond to such an attack with a full-throated counter attack. And Israel is trying to do two things. The first is more easily achievable than the second. The first is to reestablish deterrence, which is to say, if you mess with us, you're going to pay a very severe price. And the second is that Israel is trying to get rid of Hamas as a governing force and a military force in Gaza, which is going to be longer and harder to achieve. And I think that one of the early mistakes of the Israeli government acting in anger and in fury was to promise what they cannot deliver, which is the eradication of every Hamas fighter. But they want to certainly destroy the capacity of Hamas to have a military capacity and to throw these obstacles. We also should say that there's an interesting cat and mouse game taking place in Lebanon on the northern border of Israel, where Hezbollah is doing enough to make sure it's noticed, but not doing the full on attack that would get a full on attack of the Israeli military. You also had a tremendous probing of military attacks from Iranian-backed sources against Americans. And the administration has responded to that with introducing new resources into the region, introducing the Marine Evacuation Corps, which has already been in Lebanon, I believe in 2006, 2007, to evacuate Americans from Lebanon. And consequently, everybody's playing a little bit of chess. You make one move and somebody counters the move all the way through. So that's the situation that we find ourselves in. And this is Monday morning, October 30th. By the time this is seen, we may be in a new situation, but all we can do is to indicate where we are at this moment and presume that we're giving you enough of a background that you can understand the issues that are being raised and all that's involved.
Michael, you said Hamas calculated on Israel's response, and it uses I don't know if you said that, but I've heard that many times. It uses the camera on it uses the humanitarian crisis caused directly with the directly cause of Israel's response as propaganda also around the world, not only to discourage governments abroad to support Israel, but also to unleash a kind of a global jihad against Jews, which is one of their goals. And Iran wants to be the leader of the Islamic world. What's your reaction?
Let me say they're trying to arouse dramatic antagonism against Jews. I don't believe it will reach the level of jihad, because I think the governments will be responsive to attacks on their Jewish population. I think that they are trying to use the humanitarian crisis to delegitimate Israel, and also to get back to and remember, Israel has the right to defend itself. And one has to say, after October 7th, Israel has the obligation to defend its citizens. October 7th was a pogrom.
Right.
In every previous instance, it was a massive pogrom. In fact, if you think of it as a pogrom, it's the largest pogrom in Jewish history. The number dead exceed the Kishinev pogrom. The number dead exceed Kristallnacht. The number dead, the number killed, and the scope and scale. In every previous pogrom, we held the government in power responsible for that pogrom for not protecting its civilian population. And after the war is over, the Israelis are going to hold their government responsible for not protecting the civilian population. But that has to wait for another day. And when I speak to Israelis, they are enormously frustrated, but you can't switch governments in the middle. You can't have a political crisis of this magnitude in the middle. Even ardent supporters of the Israeli rights, somebody like Professor Gil Troy, has said that the prime minister should announce his resignation at the end of the war now, so he can say that I am only doing things for the interest of my country and my personal interests have no impact on my thinking, because we now have to think in national terms as to how to conduct this war, and not in personal terms of saving face for politicians who have made significant mistakes. We also haven't touched on one other thing, which is that Israel has to be cautious that the situation in the West Bank does not deteriorate, And that's a combination of two things. Number one, that the settlers don't provoke the Arabs and the Palestinians on the West Bank, and also that the Palestinians don't decide to join in. And remember, Hamas is also on the West Bank. Join in and intensify the scale, the scope, the magnitude, and also the location of all of these issues. Syria has joined in a peripheral manner, and both the United States and Israel has attacked Syria when it has joined in. The United States did not attack Syria on behalf, and let's stress this, I want to repeat this. The United States did not attack Syria on behalf of Israel. The United States attacked Syria because American troops were targeted by Iranian proxies. Let me say that one more time.
I agree. Say it one more time.
America attacked Syria because American troops were attacked by Iranian proxies, and American troops have the right to defend themselves, and the President of the United States has an obligation to defend American troops on the front lines. So this is an enormously complicated situation, but it's one we have to understand and one we have to deeply appreciate.
Do you see, or have you heard ideas for finishing Hamas in Gaza as much as possible, and at the same time ending the humanitarian crisis in Gaza?
Well, the claim of Hamas is you can end the humanitarian. Let me answer that indirectly first. The appeal of many sides is we want a ceasefire. And the problem with a ceasefire is a ceasefire means a Hamas victory. They have slaughtered 1,400 Israelis and gotten away without any consequences, and they live to fight another day. That ends the notion of Israeli deterrence, and that's an unacceptable outcome, not only to the government of Israel, but to virtually the entire population of Israel, which feels that deterrence must be reinstated. So that's number one. Hamas has asked for a 48, 72-hour ceasefire so that the humanitarian crisis can be addressed. The problem with that is that's a 48 or 72-hour crisis for Hamas to reassemble and regather its forces without an attack. That works to the advantage of Hamas, and Hamas is holding up the entrance of supplies which are coming in from Egypt and coming in via Hamas into Gaza. And consequently, we have to see that as a deliberate attempt to exacerbate the humanitarian crisis. Any feeling human being understands that there is a humanitarian crisis. Any feeling human being understands that in a rational world where the representatives of the people had concern for those people, the humanitarian crisis could not be solved, but it surely could be alleviated. But that's not the operative assumption of the way in which Hamas works.
I would just like to remind people who've ever seen the movie Black Hawk Down that it was such a clear example of humanitarian supplies coming into, I think it was Somalia, I might get the country wrong, and how the rebels grabbed all those supplies and instead of giving it to the people, used it for their own war. And every time we talk about this subject, I see those visuals and it breaks my heart because.
But let's go back even more. Why did Hamas attack at this moment in time? The attack was an attack against the normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And if that is, and the Arab street, the general population is now deeply anti-Israel. If that is held up and that possibility is destroyed, then Hamas, in one sense, has achieved one of its major goals from the attack. And every time we've come closer to peace, the radicals, and I'm not only saying the Arab radicals, I'm also saying the Israeli and Jewish radicals, have tried to sabotage the peace process, and they've succeeded. They sabotaged it. A right-wing religious nationalist sabotaged it by murdering Yitzhak Rabin, who had the credibility to move forward. Who knows what might have happened if Rabin was not assassinated. And remember, we could now be in the 23rd year of a Palestinian state. 23rd year of a Palestinian state, if Yasser Arafat had agreed to sign a deal in which he got back 95% of the land and an exchange of land, so that the Palestinians would have been whole with regard to the land. And instead, he thought he could improve his negotiating posture by approving of Intifada 2. The end result was the end of that peace process. Bill Clinton left office. Ehud Barak lost office, and the radicals came into greater control.
So if I hear you well, you're saying that you don't see possibilities to finish Hamas in Gaza as much as possible, and at the same time create humanitarian relief for the population that is not fighting with Hamas.
Evelyn, you said I don't see possibilities of defeating Hamas as much as possible. I see possibilities of defeating Hamas as much as possible. Only a Hamas, if it changes its stripe, will, in one sense, allow a full-throated relief of the humanitarian crisis. Let's be candid. It is absolutely in Israel's interest to alleviate the humanitarian crisis. It is not in Hamas's interest to alleviate the humanitarian crisis, because that means that Israel can go on and achieve its goal without all of the images that shape public opinion in the Western world and in the rest of the world. And we have to be worried about, ironically, the attack that took place in Russia at an airport in which they were hunting for Jews coming off an El Al plane. This is deliberate. One wonders how that could happen in Russia. And again, one has to look at this. So let's repeat basics. It is in Israel's interest to solve the humanitarian crisis. It is not in Hamas's interest. If the humanitarian crisis is not solved, by the way, and it's certainly in Israel's interest to make sure that fuel is not delivered to Hamas, because Hamas can use that fuel to, again, deal with generators, deal with underground tunnels, and all of that. And it is painful to see the humanitarian crisis, but it's clear who is ironically benefiting from the humanitarian crisis, which is Hamas and not the Palestinian people.
Do you think that Israel has done a good job of getting this information across in social media?
Well, you know, I have taken not to looking at social media. And the reason I've taken to not to looking at social media is because I would spend 99% of my time responding to social media. I leave that to a younger generation. I still write for something that's an ancient form of communication called a newspaper. And I use my time to use all of these broadcasts and all of these podcasts and the like. But I'm the last one to judge social media. And you know what? I can live a full and complete life and even have some influence on the world and on the people around me without taking to social media. And I think social media is let's go back. The internet now is a tool that is a megaphone for every position. And social media means that you can target and attack in all sorts of ways. And people will do an awful lot on social media that they would not do in person. I'll tell you a historical experience I had. I ran a very large organization during the first year or two of email. First year of email, I spent about 50% of my time putting out the fires that were established because people said things in email they would have never said in person, they would have never said in writing, and because they did not yet know how to delete all of the previous communications. So social media, I understand, is the means of communication of my children, but I'm enough of an ancient artifact that it's not for me, certainly not at this moment in time.
Let's look at
But I'll leave that to you guys. You guys are more savvy than I am.
No. I share a lot of your feelings and experiences about social media. So let's look for a moment at the Jewish community in America. Phyllis, you had specific questions about that.
Question is that American Jews have felt rather safe compared to that Jewish communities outside of Israel throughout the world. Do you think that they're now starting to feel really unsafe, or do they still feel safe in America?
Given everything that is happening on campus against Jews, you mean?
Jews certainly feel less safe than they did before October 7th. Massive empirical information. We also have to say that Jews are spending an awful lot of money protecting their physical security. But let's look at some good sides of it. The government of the United States is committed to protecting the Jewish community and protecting all religious communities and all ethnic communities in the United States. And we've seen, for example, police cars outside of synagogues, police cars outside of meetings. We've seen the police come in to help the Jews in some difficult campus situations. Now, the fact that the situation is difficult is bad. The fact that the police are there to protect and they're not ignoring the Jewish community is significant. We've seen a failure of some leadership to condemn this. My grandniece is a doctoral student at Cornell. There apparently, and I get this secondhand because only my wife spoke to our grandniece today. There apparently were death threats against Jews and against Israelis on Cornell's campus. And Cornell has a massive partnership in New York with the Technion or the Weizmann Institute, don't remember which, in $1 billion investment on Roosevelt Island for a great science center. Now the question becomes, death threats against Jews on a Cornell campus, if indeed that's what's happening, should lead to what? Should lead to expulsion. It also should lead to charges. So the question of safety, in fact, is going to depend on the response of the legal authorities and the active response of legal authorities. When we see Los Angeles policemen at synagogue, or even out here, I'm at American Jewish University, we feel better about it. And the other part of it is apparently, and I was in Poland, so I didn't understand it. I met with leaders of two schools who spoke about the attendance on the day of the intifada against Jews, which was a week ago Friday. And they had a 60% decline in enrollment, in attendance. Parents decided to keep their kids home. Now, we're not asking parents to put their kids on the front line, but we have to be very careful that we don't allow the enemy the victory of making it, number one, making kids afraid to be Jewish, and number two, destroying Jewish institutions with the threat of violence and not allowing Jews to gather together, to pray together, to be together with the threat of violence. I want Jews to have a thick skin at this point, and I want a certain measure of defiance in a very basic way. And we have to be careful about that. I also had a very interesting experience the night we had a demonstration in Los Angeles the night after Simchat Torah on October, I guess it was October 9th.
Monday night.
October 8th or October 9th. And Jews from all over Los Angeles gathered at one of the congregations. They filled it to standing room only. And on the way back, we saw a person we know well. And I asked him in a cordial way, non-accusatory way, "Where's your wife? She would always be here." And he said something that scared me to my core. He said, "My daughter begged us that both of us should not come because she didn't want to be an orphan." Now, it should not be the case that Jews are afraid to gather with other Jews because of the fear of violence. And by the way, if Jews have to gather with other Jews because of the fear of violence, we have to be tough enough to respond to that. And the authorities in question have to protect us and our right to gather. And thus they have. By the way, there was significant Los Angeles police presence at the rally. There was no violence whatsoever, and it was a deeply and profoundly moving experience.
Michael, we're coming to the end of this special update, unless Evelyn has a pressing question, but I want to repeat something I heard you say a week or two ago. As many people know here, Michael's a renowned Holocaust scholar, and he said, this is not 1939, because in 1939, the Jews were powerless. And in 2023, the Jews have power. And I think that's such an important thing that we need to remember. Evelyn, do you have something that you want to say?
Well, I would like to add something to that. Jews in Europe are extremely nervous right now. They have no power at all. They're totally outnumbered by Muslims who react in great amounts, so hateful, so genocidal in their verbal expressions and sometimes physical expressions and threats. So also we have in Europe, we already live with military police in front of our synagogues for a decade or more, and it doesn't make us feel safe at all, because we are attacked from all kinds of sides where the military police cannot be. I hope there will be consequences for the institutions that allow this to happen to Jewish students. I haven't heard yet where those consequences will come from, except for donors who take personal initiatives, but I haven't heard the authorities come with a policy. Do you know where Deborah Lipstadt is speaking out? I haven't heard much of her yet.
Well, Deborah Lipstadt is the U.S. ambassador on anti-Semitism, and her role her role, as it's described, is a State Department role, which means she deals with international anti-Semitism, less local. She certainly, and I've known Deborah since we were young people. The irony is you can make many accusations against Deborah Lipstadt. I happen to be a fan. The one accusation you can't make against Deborah Lipstadt is that she doesn't speak out.
Do you know where in Europe she's speaking out?
She speaks out dramatically. The other thing that we have to see is that the second gentleman, the husband of the vice president, has been leading the administration efforts on anti-Semitism, and he has spoken out again and again and again. Look, I was at a conference on anti-Semitism sponsored by Variety magazine, which drew the Hollywood elite, and person after person after person. And these are the great story makers of America, the great storytellers of America. Person after person after person, Jew and non-Jew alike, were speaking out on this. And this is a moment in which people of goodwill must speak out, must express their solidarity, and we cannot allow the situation to deteriorate to the one that we've experienced in Europe. And the other thing is, I don't want Jews to be driven by fear. I want Jews to be driven by values, by commitment, by depth. And the moment our primary experience is fear is the moment our enemies triumph. And that we cannot allow.
I think that's an excellent place to end this update. We thank you. We know we probably have other places to appear today, so we particularly thank you for coming on our show. We thank our listeners. For anyone who wants to know more about Evelyn or myself or our activities, you can go to neveragainisnowpodcast.com. And please, as Michael has just said, speak up whenever you can without putting yourself in physical harm against anti-Semitism and all hate.